So, Scott, there are two cases that are making their way to the Supreme Court in this session regarding gerrymandering. And not only are they unlikely to go in a direction that you and I and democracy would want to see, but it's conceivable that it's go even further in harming the ability for voters in this country to really have their vote count. I mean, this is ultimately what it comes down to, and it is based upon the rulings of the Supreme Court in the past 20 years. Stunning that it could come to this. I am still fixated on Bush v. Gore. I suspect that you may have your moments of that as well. But before we get to something like that, let's go back and give us a history, a little bit, if you will, of gerrymandering with the Supreme Court, because it implicates Anthony Kennedy, who exited the court, and the timing in which he exited the court and what he did before he left the court, and its implications on his legacy are really bound up in this question of gerrymandering, perhaps more than just about any other question. So tell us the history of gerrymandering and how that implicates Kennedy.
Sure, and Anthony Kennedy didn't exactly cover himself with glory in his last term, as we've talked about. So the Supreme Court has on a few occasions argued that consciously racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, and there's an irony there in which Democrats have often supported majority-minority districts, but they're actually they're better for minority representation in terms of getting more minorities in the legislature, but bad for the Democratic Party overall. So it's kind of a complicated partisan balance, which is one reason perhaps that on a few occasions the Supreme Court has intervened. What the Supreme Court has never done is argued that a gerrymander done for partisan reasons is unconstitutional, but there have never been 5 votes for the Scalia position that partisan gerrymandering is just a political question that the courts can't address. So it's the classic thing where Kennedy wouldn't vote to strike down gerrymanders, but would always hold out the hope that something would be so egregious as to trigger that. Well, last year in Gill versus Whitford, which I think we talked about, there was just the ridiculous Wisconsin gerrymander where Republicans were able to turn 50% of the vote into 69% of the seats, and that persists. I believe Republicans lost. Democrats got about 54% of the votes for the Wisconsin legislature and barely picked up any seats. I mean, the gerrymander essentially means that Wisconsin Republicans can't lose under current partisan norms. It would just be like it's impossible. And yet, Kennedy, who looked at oral arguments like this was going to be the one that finally triggered him, obviously just refused to say anything. And then the case ended up being dismissed on standing grounds. But I think most people have interpreted that as, the liberals would rather do that than just have a loss. But at any rate, Kennedy just would not sign on to any opinion striking down the gerrymander. And essentially, if the Wisconsin gerrymander isn't unconstitutional, nothing is.
All right. I want to just, I just want to stop, and I want people to marinate a little bit in this concept, because it goes by quickly, and I don't think people fully understand how outrageous and really, in many respects, just like fundamentally anti-democratic this is. In Wisconsin, 50, and this is not like, look, the Electoral College is set up this way. That is in the Constitution. You and I could disagree with it. It can be anti-democratic, but I mean, that's the way it's set up. The idea of the Senate is, somewhat anti-democratic because you have 2 senators who have the same votes, whether they come from, Wyoming with, 1 million people less in its population versus the 2 senators who come from California with millions and millions of people who represent their vote. But that's set up, and we all know that on the day that, when we go in to cast our ballots. But I would argue that the people of Wisconsin are just not familiar with the idea that 56% of them go to vote on, for their state legislators, and they vote for the Democrat. But we end up with a legislature that is 63% Republican. That's just stunning. And if that's not a sort of like an offensive gerrymander, like you say, nothing could be. But Kennedy also asked, right, a decade ago, could there be a social science solution to assessing when a gerrymander has gone too far? And social scientists responded and provided that answer in that Whitford case, and that was still not enough. So we are now stuck with no response, and we have two cases that are now heading to the Supreme Court. Tell us about those cases.
Before I get to that, just to pick up on your point, one really telling thing is that, that what the conservatives have said is, it's just impossible to come up with standards. It's beyond the reach of social science. And that's actually not true. That the same social science that allows gerrymanders to be so devastating, all the computer models and all that, also mean that it's much easier than it used to be to come up with fair standards. And Roberts kind of made fun of that oral argument, saying, that's gobbledygook. I don't understand math. It's, but that's just, fake anti-intellectualism. And what really gets me is that this worked in Pennsylvania, that the state courts there, used social science. They drew up a map that didn't benefit Democrats. It was just fair, and it worked perfectly fine, that we have the tools in social science to say, we can construct a relatively fair map. And like one person, one vote, if the map, gives a 0.5% edge to one party or the other, that's within the realm of democratic acceptability. You can't, there'll be some marginal cases, but it's just the idea that it's impossible to come up with standards is just nonsense. It's just complete nonsense. But it's clear that Roberts will do that anyway. So that leads us into these. This leads us into these cases, one of which is from Maryland and one of which is from North Carolina. And there are a couple interesting things about that case selection. The first thing is that North Carolina, and I think we've talked about this before too, sort of demonstrates that there's really, in most cases, no meaningful difference between a partisan gerrymander and a racial gerrymander. Literally the week after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, North Carolina legislators asked for racial data about voting. So they got data for African Americans. They asked, can we get this for Latinos? They asked for this data, and they made an omnibus change to the state's election statute, every single one of which made it more difficult for African Americans to vote or went after African American voters. As the Fourth Circuit found in a unanimous opinion, it targeted African American voters with almost surgical precision. So really, to call that just a partisan gerrymander as opposed to a racial gerrymander, it's a distinction without a difference. It deliberately targeted African Americans, and if it did that because they were Democrats rather than because they were African Americans, that's still discriminatory. Who cares? It violates the 14th Amendment either way. It doesn't matter what your motives for discriminating against African Americans are, or at least shouldn't. So, again, North Carolina isn't, and really Wisconsin has the same properties that, and Wisconsin legislators are very upfront about that is, why should voters in Madison and Milwaukee be able to decide the outcomes of elections just because more people live there? It's the same, and it's not, and with the not very hidden subtext that why should African American voters get a say in who becomes governor or who's in the legislature?
And Scott, I would add, the irony is, of course, there was a Texas redistricting case where the intent, it was sort of like almost the converse, right? Was because the Texas legislature did not create the original racially constructed districts, then their intent was irrelevant, even though in the end it was racialized in that respect. So it sort of cut the other direction for that Texas legislature. All right, well, listen, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about what we anticipate the Supreme Court will do with its newest members, Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, in terms of this redistricting, and that it could actually get worse Because this year in Michigan, we saw a situation where by referendum, the citizens of Michigan said, like, we're done with this gerrymandering. Let's let an independent commission deal with it. Well, the Supreme Court may have some other ideas. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Scott Lemieux will tell us about that. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.